Fort Hood, 1958. The air burned with dust and diesel. A young private named Elvis Presley tuned a battered guitar, his fame stripped away by army khaki. When a sergeant laughed at him in front of the whole camp, Elvis didn't argue. He just played one song, and the entire base went silent. The Texas sun was merciless that August afternoon. Fort Hood shimmered like a mirage. Rows of barracks stretching across red dirt, trucks rumbling, bugles cutting through the heat. It smelled of diesel, sweat, and iron. Thousands of young men marched in formation, their boots slamming like a single heartbeat. And somewhere among them, a private named Elvis Aaron Presley tried to disappear. He wasn't the king here, not the man whose voice had filled theaters, or the one whose hips had scandalized television hosts. Here, he was just Private Presley, serial number 533-10761, assigned to the 2nd Armored Division. His famous hair was shorn to regulation. His stage clothes had been traded for khaki and dust. He carried himself quietly. Polite. Yes, sir. No, sir. Always on time. Always careful not to stand out, because every pair of eyes on that base already knew who he was. Some stared in awe. Others stared with envy. That evening, after lights out, the barracks buzzed with idle chatter. Cards slapped, radios hissed, laughter echoed between bunks. Then, almost shyly, Elvis opened a battered guitar case beneath his cot. The wood was scratched and sun-faded, initials carved near the bridge. It wasn't luxury anymore. It was memory. He strummed a soft G chord. One soldier paused mid-conversation. Another turned his head. By the third note, the entire barracks had quieted. "Elvis, man, play something," one of them whispered. He hesitated, glancing toward the door. "Can't be too loud," he said softly. "Sergeant'll tan me alive," but they insisted. So he played. Just a few bars of That's All Right, muffled and slow. The rhythm floated like smoke in the dim light. For a moment, it felt like before. The stage lights, the screams, the thrill of creation. But here, it wasn't applause. It was curiosity. A handful of tired soldiers listening to a man who once ruled the airwaves. Then the door slammed open. Sergeant Charles Whitmore stepped in, 40 years old, eyes like gunmetal, a veteran of Korea, the kind of man whose voice could slice a room in half. "What's this, Presley?" he barked. "You think you're on the Ed Sullivan Show again?" Laughter erupted. Some soldiers tried not to smile. Elvis froze, guitar in hand. Whitmore smirked. "We got ourselves a movie star. Why don't you sing us to sleep, sweetheart?" He waited for a punchline that didn't come. Elvis didn't argue, didn't flinch. He just set the guitar down, real gentle, like it was something sacred. The room stayed silent after that. Later, as the others drifted to sleep, one soldier leaned toward him. "Man, why don't you just tell him who you are? You're Elvis Presley." Elvis stared at the ceiling. "Doesn't matter here," he whispered. He wouldn't hear it anyway. Outside, crickets chirped in the Texas dark. A truck rolled by, headlights cutting through the thin barracks curtains. Elvis turned the guitar over in his hands, tracing the carvings on its neck. Somewhere in the distance, a radio played faintly. A familiar voice. His voice, singing through static. What does it mean to start over when everyone already knows your name? How do you stay true to yourself when the world only remembers your shadow? He closed his eyes. Tomorrow he'd try again. The next evening, he'd bring the guitar back out. And this time, he wouldn't play for himself. He'd play for them. And that was when the sergeant's boots would echo down the hall again. The next night, the mess hall buzzed louder than usual. It was Friday, payday. Plates clattered, cards shuffled, voices rose above the hum of old ceiling fans. The air smelled of meatloaf and machine oil. Elvis sat in the corner, guitar across his knees. He didn't plan to play, but soldiers kept nudging him, whispering, "Come on, just one song, man." He hesitated. "Ain't a stage," he murmured. Then the door slammed open again. Sergeant Whitmore stormed in, coffee mug in hand. "Presley!" he growled. "Still think you're at Graceland?" Laughter rippled through the room like a spark through gasoline. Dozens of eyes turned toward him, half amused, half cruel. Someone shouted, Give us a show, King, Whitmore sneered. Tell you what, you got 1 minute, Private. Entertain your fans. The laughter swelled, but Elvis didn't flinch. He rose slowly, the chair scraping the floor, and slung the guitar strap over his shoulder. He adjusted the tuning pegs with calm precision. The crowd expected defiance. Instead, he whispered, "Yes, sir." That line, soft, steady, changed the room. The teasing turned uneasy. Even the air felt heavy. Elvis glanced once at the floor, then began to play. The first chord rolled out like a prayer. Not rock, not rebellion, just truth. Peace in the Valley, his mother's favorite hymn. His voice started low, trembling slightly. The notes wove through the mess hall, bouncing off tin trays and metal walls. The soldiers went still. Forks froze halfway to mouths. The hum of the fluorescent lights became the only sound behind him. As he sang, something shifted. The laughter melted into silence. Whitmore crossed his arms, jaw tight. He wanted to mock, but couldn't. The song hit too deep. When Elvis reached the line, "There'll be peace in the valley for me," the old sergeant's hand trembled around his mug. His eyes glistened. For 30 seconds, nobody breathed. Then, as the last chord faded, the sound of a fork clattering onto a tray cut through the quiet. It was over. Elvis lowered the guitar. "That's all I got, sir." Whitmore didn't move. Then he said, almost to himself, "My brother didn't make it back from the valley." No one spoke. The soldiers glanced at one another, unsure what to do. Elvis nodded once, slow and respectful. For a heartbeat, 2 worlds, celebrity and soldier, grief and grace, stood side by side. And for the first time, Sergeant Whitmore looked at Elvis Presley not as a joke, but as a man. Outside, the Texas wind carried the last note into the darkness. Somewhere, a guard paused mid-step, hearing a sound he couldn't explain. What happens when pride meets humility head-on? Can a single voice reach where rank and command cannot? The next morning, the story spread across the base. "Presley sang last night," someone said at breakfast. "Even the sergeant cried," another whispered. A cook in the canteen swore he'd heard the whole thing through the vent. By noon, half the camp knew about it. But Elvis said nothing. He spent the day hauling supplies, head down, same as before. That night, someone left a folded note on his bunk. Just 2 words. "Thank you." He didn't need to know who wrote it. He just knew the laughter was gone. And before long, something else, something far greater, was about to begin. Morning broke quiet over Fort Hood. The sky glowed pale orange, and the dust hung in the air like smoke from an old memory. No one spoke much at breakfast. Even the loud ones kept their voices down. Something had changed overnight. Elvis walked through the mess line, tray in hand. The same soldiers who once laughed now gave small nods as he passed. No one said it out loud, but they all felt it. The echo of that song still lingered. Sergeant Whitmore sat alone at a corner table, staring into his coffee. When Elvis approached, he looked up for a moment, then looked away. The old man seemed smaller now, his shoulders lower, his voice gone. Later that day, during drills, the rhythm of boots striking dirt filled the parade field. Whitmore barked orders as usual, but his tone had softened. No more jokes, no more sneers, only focus. When Elvis's line passed, their eyes met briefly. The sergeant gave a small nod, barely there, but real. That night, the barracks were still. Someone had left the door open, and the Texas wind moved through like a slow breath. Elvis sat on his bunk, guitar across his lap. He didn't plan to play, but his fingers found the strings anyway. A few chords, soft and low. Then, from the next bunk over, a voice joined in. Another soldier hummed the melody, rough but warm. One by one, others added quiet harmonies. No words, no spotlight. Just a group of tired men finding peace for a moment. Halfway through the song, the door opened. Sergeant Whitmore stepped inside. The room froze. He stood there for a long second, saying nothing. Then, to everyone's shock, he took off his hat and sat down. "Go on, Presley," he said quietly. Don't stop on my account." Elvis smiled faintly and kept playing. The chords filled the air, wrapping around them like smoke from a campfire. It was fragile, human, and holy all at once. Whitmore's eyes glistened again. His hands, calloused from years of command, trembled slightly. When the last chord faded, silence took over. A deep, weighty silence, one that felt sacred. No one clapped. No one dared to. It wasn't a performance anymore. It was a prayer. Whitmore stood up and cleared his throat. "My brother used to sing that," he muttered. "He never made it home from Korea. Guess that song brought him back for a minute." Elvis nodded. "Then I'm glad I sang it, sir." The sergeant swallowed hard and turned toward the door. "Carry on, men," he said softly, voice cracking. When he left, no one spoke for a long time. They just sat there, letting the silence linger. What kind of courage does it take to stay gentle in a hard world? How can a single song carry the weight of someone's grief? The next morning, soldiers across the base were whispering again, only this time not out of mockery. It was reverence. Someone had recorded the performance on a small reel-to-reel tape. By week's end, that bootleg was making rounds from barracks to barracks, labelled only with 2 words. Mess Hall Miracle. Officers heard it. Chaplains heard it. Even the base radio operator played it late one night, the soft hymn drifting through static to anyone still awake. By dawn, a quiet legend was born, and from that night on, no one ever laughed at Elvis Presley again. The mess hall had never been so full. A week after that night, soldiers started showing up early, grabbing chairs, dragging crates, anything to sit close to the man who'd once been mocked. By 1900 hours, the place was packed. Nearly 300 soldiers shoulder to shoulder, plates forgotten, eyes fixed on the corner where Elvis sat with his guitar. Even the officers came. They stood in the back, arms folded, pretending not to care. But they were listening. Everyone was. When Elvis strummed his first chord, a hush fell over the room, so deep you could hear the ceiling fan creak. He didn't make an announcement or crack a joke. He just played. Simple, honest, each note like a heartbeat. That night he didn't sing rock and roll. He sang songs the men knew from home, hymns, country tunes, fragments of the blues. His voice carried warmth through the cold steel walls, through loneliness and homesickness, through the ache of men far from their families. One soldier, Private Danny Harlan, whispered later that it was the first time he'd stopped missing home since arriving. "It felt," he said, "like my mama's kitchen again." When the song ended, no one moved. Then slowly the clapping began, soft at first, then thunderous. The walls shook. Even Sergeant Whitmore, once the loudest critic in camp, stood up and saluted him. Elvis looked stunned. "Thank you," he said softly. After that, the music became a ritual. Every Friday night, after drills, the soldiers would gather. Some brought harmonicas, others clapped or stomped along. The laughter that once mocked him now filled the room with joy. Outside the mess hall, someone hung a cardboard sign. Presley's show, 1900. No tickets. No rank. Bootleg tapes of these sessions began to circulate across bases in Texas. Soldiers called them the Fort Hood sessions. They weren't studio perfect. The audio hissed, voices overlapped. But there was magic inside that tape, something raw and real. Letters home started mentioning Elvis the Humble Soldier. Even Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, ran a small story. Private Presley wins respect at Fort Hood. For the first time since being drafted, Elvis didn't feel like a stranger wearing a uniform. He was part of something bigger, a brotherhood, and Sergeant Whitmore? He changed too. The man who once barked orders now stayed after drills to talk music. He admitted one night, "Didn't think you had that kind of soul, Presley." Elvis smiled. "Guess you never asked." The two shared coffee in the canteen more than once. Whitmore told stories about Korea, about the frozen rivers, the sounds of gunfire, and the brother he lost. Elvis listened quietly, never interrupting. Humility has a strange power. It can turn mockery into friendship, walls into bridges. What if every argument in the world had a song instead of a shout? How many hearts could change if one man decided not to fight back? By spring of 1959, Elvis's music nights had become legend. Recruits from other units would sneak in to hear him play. Someone painted a tiny crown on the mess hall wall, no one admitted who. Then, one humid morning, a new order arrived. A slip of paper taped to the door of his barracks. Deployment, Germany. He read it twice. His stomach sank. That evening, the men gathered one last time. No one spoke at first. Whitmore broke the silence. "Looks like we're losing our best singer," Elvis chuckled. "Guess I'll have to find new fans across the ocean." They laughed, but it wasn't the same kind of laughter as before. It was respect, wrapped in sadness. He picked up his guitar and played one final song, a soft version of Blue Moon of Kentucky. When it ended, no one clapped. They just stood there, hats off, eyes glassy. Whitmore stepped forward and placed his hand on Elvis's shoulder. "You ever need anything, son," he said. "You got brothers here." The room was silent again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of unity, of something sacred born from humility. Outside, the wind carried his last note across the parade field, and for a long while after, no one wanted to leave. The morning Elvis was set to leave, Fort Hood felt unusually still. The bugle call echoed softer, almost respectful, as if the base itself knew someone important was going. Elvis packed light, uniform folded, guitar slung over his shoulder, a single duffel by the bunk. His fellow soldiers stood in the corridor, pretending not to stare. They'd seen celebrities come and go on posters, but never through their own barracks door. When he stepped outside, the Texas wind hit his face. Dust swirled around his boots. On the parade ground, Sergeant Whitmore was waiting. No smirk this time. No barked orders. Just quiet. Whitmore walked forward, hand behind his back. "Presley," he said, voice rough. "You got a minute?" Elvis nodded. "Yes, sir." The sergeant handed him a folded patch, the unit insignia of the 2nd Armored Division, worn and frayed at the edges. "This was my brother's," he said. "He wore it in Korea. I think you should have it." Elvis froze. He understood what it meant. In the army, a patch like that wasn't decoration. It was memory. "I can't take this, sir." Whitmore shook his head. "You already did the night you sang that song. You reminded me what peace sounds like." For a moment, neither man spoke. The wind carried faint music from a far-off radio. Elvis's own voice, from a recording made years before. Heartbreak Hotel, thin and distant, like a ghost waving goodbye. Elvis smiled sadly. "Guess they still play me out there," Whitmore chuckled softly. "They play you in here too," he said, tapping his chest. Elvis tucked the patch carefully into his breast pocket. "I'll keep it safe." When the transport truck rumbled up, soldiers began gathering, waving, shouting his name. Not Private Presley now, but Elvis. The same voices that once laughed now cheered him off like a brother going to war. Whitmore leaned close. "You taught me something, Presley. Not all battles need guns." Elvis looked him in the eye. "No, sir," he said. "Sometimes all you need is a song." He climbed into the truck. The engine roared to life, drowning the quiet emotion in their throats. As the vehicle rolled away, he turned once more, raising a hand in salute. Whitmore returned it, stiff and proud. For a long time after, the sergeant stood alone on the field, watching the dust settle where the truck had been. He didn't move until the sound disappeared completely. In Germany, Elvis unpacked the same guitar and hung Whitmore's patch on the wall above his bed. Nights were colder there, lonelier too. Between drills, he began writing. Lines about missing home, about promises, about love that survives distance. Some say those nights birthed the seeds of Can't Help Falling in Love. And are you lonesome tonight? Whether true or not, one thing was certain. The boy who had entered Fort Hood left as a man who understood silence better than applause. Years later, a reporter would ask him about the army days. Elvis smiled and said, "I learned that respect is louder than fame. What would you carry if you had to leave everything else behind? And who would you become when no one's watching? Back at Fort Hood, Whitmore kept an old bootleg tape labeled Mess Hall, Presley. Sometimes after lights out, he'd play it quietly, letting that familiar voice fill the empty barracks. He never told anyone, but the men could hear it through the walls, soft, steady, like the heartbeat of something that refused to die. And though the war stories would fade, that sound would stay. Years passed. The boy who once sat alone in a Fort Hood barracks became a legend again. But this time, the fame felt different. The crowds were bigger, the lights brighter. Yet in quiet moments backstage, Elvis often thought about that night when the entire base went silent. March 1972. Madison Square Garden. More than 20,000 people filled the arena. Flashbulbs popped like fireworks as Elvis stepped onto the stage in his white jumpsuit, rhinestones glinting under the spotlights. The roar was deafening, but before he sang, he glanced down at his guitar strap, and there it was, that same army patch, stitched near the buckle. Whitmore's patch. He never performed without it. The band started, horns blazing, crowd cheering, but for one small second, Elvis closed his eyes and heard something else. The stillness of that Fort Hood mess hall, the way those soldiers had stopped laughing, the weight of that silence. He smiled, then he sang. The performance was electric. Reviewers called it divine, untouchable, pure soul. But to him, it wasn't about glory anymore. It was about gratitude for the men who'd taught him what real respect sounded like. When the show ended, he whispered into the mic, "This one's for my brothers in Texas." Most fans thought it was a casual line. Few knew the truth behind it. After the concert, in his dressing room, Elvis opened a small case. Inside, a folded letter from years before, yellowed edges, creased from being read too many times. The handwriting was uneven. You reminded an old soldier what peace sounds like. Sergeant C. Whitmore. Elvis kept that letter until the day he died. When the news of his passing broke in August 1977, the world mourned. But among the thousands of flowers sent to Graceland, one stood out, a single wreath from the U.S. Army 2nd Armored Division, with a ribbon that read, "From the men who never forgot." A few years later, Whitmore's family visited Graceland. In a quiet room filled with uniforms and memorabilia, they found something behind glass, a worn guitar and a framed patch beneath it. A small brass plaque read, "Fort Hood, 1958, the song that stopped the camp." Whitmore's daughter stood there for a long time. "He never told us much," she said, "but he always said that night changed him. And in a way, it changed Elvis too. He had seen how pride could break, how laughter could turn to grace, and how silence, real, honest silence, could speak louder than fame ever could. Even today, old veterans tell the story. Some say they were there, others swear they heard the tape. A few even claim to have seen the tears in Whitmore's eyes. The legend lives on, whispered in fan clubs, mentioned on radio shows, remembered by those who know that humility, not applause, is what makes a man great. Because the truth is, the world will always remember the king. But the soldiers at Fort Hood remember the man who laid down his pride, picked up a guitar, and healed a room full of hardened hearts with a single song. True power isn't in applause. It's in the silence that follows, when every heart finally understands. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes kindness is weakness. Let them hear how a quiet act of grace turned mockery into respect, and music into healing. And if you were ever stationed at Fort Hood, or know someone who served, tell them, the song that silenced the camp still echoes today.